this session, we will be discussing the impact of the Russia-Ukraine conflict on the Middle East. The subtopics are 1, great powers competition in the new Middle East, 2, time frame for reconstructing trust, 3, New World Order or New World Disorder, 4, priorities for reconstruction, and 5, status of JCPOA. Unfortunately, in the interest of time, I was told that there might not be questions. No? Okay. All right, let me go ahead and introduce the panelists for this session. Okay, initially we're going to have Ambassador Bilahari KAUSIKAN. Let me convey his apologies. He had a personal emergency and he's unable to join us today. But we have with us Professor Dr. Kiani. It's in the room. There he is. Professor Kiani is a professor in international relations at the Islamic Azad University and vice president at the Institute of Iran and Eurasia Studies. Next up, we have Dr. Vasily Kuznetsov, whom I believe is joining us online. He's the head of the Center for Arab and Islamic Studies and head of the Institute of Oriental Studies at the Russia Academy of Sciences. We have two with us. Dr. Qin Tian, Assistant Director of Institute of Middle East Studies at the China Institute of Contemporary International Relations in the People's Republic of China. And next to me, we have Professor Fouad Izzadi, Professor of International Relations at the University of Tehran in Iran. Welcome, panelists. All right, without further ado, let me go ahead and give the floor to Professor Kiani. Sure, you can speak.
Thank you. Before I go into this question, I would like to express my deep gratitude to the organizers of this conference, especially Iranian embassy in Romania, the ambassador, and my friend Mr. Flavius Kavamalia and Prophet. You know, the Ukrainian crisis can be regarded as a geopolitical earthquake in the international politics and international system. And of course, it had some repercussion and consequences for the Middle East. As a researcher in international relations, I do believe that this crisis is unprecedented from the Second World War, and even we don't know. I don't know any crisis in international relations after the Second World War with such a magnitude and repercussion on the global, on the international and global politics. The thing that distinguishes this crisis from the previous ones is that it's the first time that the great powers indirectly confront each other at the international and global system, and it could be regarded as an event that can change the game between the great powers. Some scholars predict that this crisis could intensify and accelerate the bipolar system, not by Russia and the United States, but by United States and China. The second point, which could be as the second variety of this crisis, is that the language of this confrontation is not political in the framework of the armed race, but it's completely economic and by economic tools. As a scholar who studied Iran-EU relations, I never predicted 4 years ago that Germany was ready or is ready to reduce its dependency on oil and gas on Russia at the moment for 15%. 15% for Germany is too much at the moment. And they have decided to cut their dependency on Russian energy to and reduces to 10% in 2025, which is a big and huge record for Germany. Uh, one of the problem and one of the challenges that I think international relations and international politics faces is that there was a mutual interdependence between Europe and Russia on economic matters, especially energy, oil and gas. And to quote Fyodor Lukyanov as a senior researcher in Russia, that the trend is going in a way that there could be, it is my term, not Lukyanov, there would be a divorce between Russia and Europe on the matter of energy. And if it happened, it could be as an end in the relation between EU and Russia, and it could be a new start of geopolitical tension between Russia when Russia see itself in isolation and see itself in a way that Europe wants to isolate Russia in the point of the energy. Russia would do anything to change the game in European politics. I don't remember when and where I read an interview which was done with ex-chancellor of Germany. Merkel said that Russia has lost its status as a partner for European Union. I think this interruption has been started as going to be continued would have geopolitical tensions in the future, as has already begun. Regarding the repercussions and consequences of the Ukrainian crisis over the Middle East, I think without this crisis, Middle East has always had the magnet for lots of geopolitical conflict between the states and the proxy wars between the states. And this crisis has poured the gasoline on the fire of the geopolitical rivalry between a state that has already, I think, has begun. One of the speakers, I heard that today, and of course there is a perception, if I don't say dominant perception, but there is a perceptions international relations that Russian role in the Middle East is declining because of the Russian grappling with Ukrainian politics and crisis, whatever. I think that the declining role is not a useful word to describe and understand what is happening in the Middle East, because maybe I prefer to use Russian deficit in the Middle East. I mean, there are reports that Russia has declined its presence, its forces in the Middle East because to transfer them into Ukrainian soil to manage the crisis over there. But the question is that if Russia feels that the West is going to push the Russia into the corner, it would do anything to take itself out of the crisis. I mean, the potentiality and the capacity of the Russia previous to the Ukrainian crisis in making balance between different conflicting parties can change into a disturbing potentiality. Russia has this capacity to disturb what is going on in the Middle East, and I would say that
a big geopolitical rivalry and even tension in the Middle East could act as a windfall, as a gift for Russia to divert attention from Ukrainian crisis to the Middle East, as the Ukrainian crisis did this job for Iran, and this crisis diverted the attention from the nuclear talks with Iran to the Ukrainian crisis. And from this point of view, this crisis what has been beneficial for Iranian authorities. I think that the shadows of the Ukrainian crisis has already um, uh, brought about in the Middle East, and somehow anti-Iranian alignment has been is going to shape between the Israel, Turkey, and Persian Gulf states against Iran. Uh, um, Israel has started to somehow, in the absence or relative absence of the Russia in Latakia, to bombard and to expand its airstrike against Iran. Israel has tried to leverage this relative absence of the Russia to intensify its position in Syria. Regarding Turkey, we have the same trend. Turkey seems that trying to somehow um, uh, uh, consolidate its presence in the northern of Syria and even more, while it sees that Russia is highly involved in Syria, in Ukrainian crisis. From the point of Iran and how Iran's approach the Ukrainian crisis, as you know, we can't say anything for sure because of the complexity of the situations and advantages and disadvantages that has been provided to Iran because of this crisis. The disadvantages that we can name for this crisis is that Russia, because of the sanctions and the reluctancy of the European Union to import oil and gas from Russia, they have pivoted to Asia. And according to some statistics, 50%, around 50% of the Russian oil has been redelivered to Asia, which could and has turned Russia as a potential rival of Iran in Asian market. In an example, India, as a zero importer of the Russian oil, now after 4 months, has imported more than 900 billion barrels a day, which India was a traditional market of Iran's oil. The second, regarding the gas, we have the same trend because Russia tried to send LNG to Turkey, to Afghan, to Pakistan. And from this point of view, Russia could be a serious challenger for Iranian market in this regard. But it is not, it is part of a story and it's not the whole story. We have some points regarding the energy which could be beneficial for Iran because thanks to this crisis, oil price has increased drastically, and for Iran, which has been severely under the sanction of the United States and Europe, this hike in oil price is a gift and windfall for Iran's current administrations. Second, because of the sanctions that Europe has imposed on Russian oil, it seems that United States relatively has been lenient regarding the Iran's oil export to the Asian market to somehow compensate for the cut that happened in European oil market from the Russia. So from this point of view, Iran has benefited from this Ukrainian crisis. Third point, I think, was a north-south corridor. North-south corridor was not a dead plan. It was signed 20 years ago between Russia, India, and Iran as a memorandum, but neither Russia nor India make themselves so obliged to use this plan for transporting. Now, with Russia's involvement in the crisis, they have redirected the attention to this strategic network, and there are some positive ground that the North Stream corridor would be resurrected again, and that would, I think, help to grow Iranians' importance from the point of transportation of commodities from the north to the south. Third point is about the trade between Russia and Iran. Moderately, on average, the volume of trade between Russia and Iran has been between $1 billion to $2 billion a year. Now, thanks to the Ukrainian crisis and the economic war between Russia and Europe over the trade, it has rise to more than $4.5 billion, which is a high record in the trade between Russia and Iran. And there are some promising ground that this bilateral trade will increase. There are lots of Russian economic board who are coming to Iran to expand their relations, and since they have a common language, the common language is Western sanctions, they have a strong motive to expand the trade and commercial relations. Regarding the nuclear talks between Iran and 5+1, I think everyone knows that the shadow of this crisis can be touched regarding this nuclear. First of all, it was understood that Russia are trying to somehow avert the nuclear talk to reach to a final agreement, but I think that was not true. Of course, Russia does not like to see that the nuclear talk would be finalized and new deal on the framework of the JCPOA. It creates between the Iran and 5+1, but the point is that Iran is so reluctant to have a new deal with the United States and the European Union because of some concerns and serious concerns that Iran has.
Professor Kiani,
2 minutes.
I mean, we have a connection and international connection, and
Okay.
we are obliged.
Less than 1 minute, I
Thank you
will
so much.
finish.
Thank you.
Okay. Sorry. The problem is that Iran does not trust the United States because there is a slipstream of the previous deal between Iran and 5+1, and Iran is not sure that the prospect for the new deal would be promising because the Biden is famous for being a 4-year president, and the next president would be arguably a Republican one. And for Iran is nearly 50%. Iran is sure that the new deal would not have any promising future. So it's not in Iran's interest to pay in cash, I mean, give its winning card and get in credit, like what happened in the previous deal, which United States does not seem that try to persuade Iran to give Iran a tangible guarantee to embolden Iran to have a new deal with United States. As far as United States and Europe does not try to persuade Iran tangibly with giving more concessions regarding the New Deal, it makes Iran's this right to be reluctant, and the problem and the shadow of we cannot deny the shadow of the Ukrainian crisis in discouraging Iran to not to be hasty in signing a new deal with 5+1. Sorry for I stop here. Thank you.
No worries. Thank you very much, Professor Kiani. I would just quickly add that not only is Russia competing for oil customer, it's also selling below price to the Chinese market. All right, let's go ahead and move on to the next speaker. That's Dr. Vasily Kuznetsov, who's joining us online.
Yes. Hello. First of all, I would like to express my sincere gratitude for the invitation. I think that it's very important for us, for our expert community, for researchers, to continue the dialogue on the most sensitive issues today when we have to pass through a very dangerous period of our common history. You have noticed several topics. You have noticed several main topics in this session and agenda. I'm not sure I can focus on every of them, but I will try. Let's start with the question of a new world order and disorder. I think that there is a consensus that on this issue, that the conflict in Ukraine and the conflict between Russia and the West is not an ordinary local or regional or even global conflict, but it is a stage in a transformation of the whole world system. And at this stage, we have a simplification of the system of international relations. We have a crisis of main institutions, global governance, and global security, which leads us to reactualization of basic forms of international relations, of war and violence. So this stage of global disorder is, of course, violent, dramatic, and tragic for us as human beings on personal level, on moral level. But at the same time, it is not strange for international relations as a whole. Last time, I think that it is important that last time the transformational period extended about 30 years from 1914 to the end of the Second World War. And at the beginning of the period, nobody could predict not just the configuration of the global system, of a new global system, but even in its main parameters. Before it, the Westphalian system also was established during about 30 years, several decades. So we should be ready for several decades of transformation. And the best thing we can do, we should try to prevent an absolute catastrophe at this period. Now I move to the issue of the great power competition in the Middle East. Previously, we thought that the Middle East can be a region of some kind of cooperation between Russia and the Western partners, even in the situation of a huge deterioration of our bilateral relations. We can mention here our very productive, fruitful cooperation with European partners in Libya, Berlin Conference, and the meeting in Moscow before it. We can mention here our movement on parallel tracks with the United States and Syria when we fight at ISIS, and so on. But today the situation has changed because of Ukraine, but more than because of Ukraine, because of the new character of Russian-Western confrontation. And I would highlight several effects of the new situation on the Middle East. In short and mid-term, Middle Eastern oil resources become more important for world economy. But in long-term perspective, as I understand, we will see the acceleration of the transformation of energy sector in the world. So in long-term perspective, the Middle East oil productive states have to find for them new place in global market and in global international system. Second point is that global logistic ties moved to the Middle East, and Professor Kiani mentioned the logistic corridors through Iran with the Iranian participation, but we shouldn't forget about Suez. We shouldn't forget about other transport corridors in the Middle East. And in this situation, Turkey, Iran, Egypt, GCC states becomes not just more powerful, but also more sovereign, economically sovereign, and potentially Syria too. The third point is that in the same time, those countries who suffer from deficiency of logistical or natural resources will face a number of new risks of socio-economic and socio-political fragility because of the food problem and water problem. So there will be more political and economical polarization of the Middle Eastern region. Transformation of global logistic, Russian-Chinese rapprochement, and European needs to offset Russian markets will increase European role in the Middle East. But the limits of this increasing role will be linked with the domestic European situation. I will focus on this later. All these issues will lead to reconfiguration of the internal Middle Eastern regional system and to its new relations of this regional system with global powers. Domestically, I think there are more changes to build the regional order today from inside the region, not from the outside, on the basis of multilateral consensus between the regional stakeholders. And in this context, the main problem, as I understand, and the most fragile element of the process is the Israel and its role in the regional politics. So the Iranian-Israeli acts of Iranian-Israeli acts will be the main challenging problem in the regional relations, I think, in next period. Internationally, great powers will have to face new challenges in the region. For Russia, main dilemma here is the following: how to keep the same tactics of friendship with everybody. And we can see that most of the regional states are neutral or support Russia in Russian politics, in new Russian politics. How to keep these tactics of friendship with everybody in the situation of polarization of world politics and increasing Western pressure on the Middle Eastern states. The same question is for these states: how to keep the balance in power politics. I mean, especially Saudi Arabia, Arab Emirates, and several others. How to keep the balance in politics in these new circumstances? I think it will be difficult. But for the United States, there are 2 or 3 dilemmas. First, how to keep leadership without new engagement. It is obvious that in the situation of polarization, the allies will demand from the United States more support for to pay them more for their for the support of the Western politics towards Russia. The other problem is how to make American politics more successive and independent from electoral cycles. Professor Kiani mentioned several problems with the JCPOA linked with the American electoral cycles. But we can see that all the relations between the United States and the Arab countries and the other Middle Eastern countries depend more and more from the electoral cycles of the United States. The third problem is how to combine values and pragmatism. And we can see this problem in the American-Saudi relations. We can see that 2 of 3 questions, 2 of 3 dilemmas linked with the American politics in the United States are not about the foreign politics, but about the domestic situation in the United States. And the projection of the domestic situation weakened the American position in the region. And the same situation we can see with European countries. From the one hand, as I said, there will be economic rapprochement between them and the Middle Eastern countries, but from the other hand, Europe will have to find a new foreign political identity and a new paradigm of their foreign politics, taking into consideration the militarization of the European countries, the confrontation against Russia, a number of socio-political domestic problems in the main European countries. I think that it is an important moment that while we look at Russia, United States, and Europe in the Middle East, the main dilemmas of their politics in the Middle East are associated not with the situation in the Middle East itself, but with their domestic situation of their global role. So it makes the politics in the region dependent of the global context and global identity. As I understand the situation with China and India, who become more and more active in the region, is different. They can keep foreign politics in the region as foreign politics. They can keep the realistic paradigm of the politics in this region. All these dilemmas of great powers create, I think, a window of opportunities for several years, as I understand, from 3 to 5 years, for the Middle East to become a more independent and more sovereign collective center of new global order. And it will lead us to some sort of consolidation of the region, despite the fact of the socioeconomic domestic problems and despite the fact of the specific political culture. I will stop here. Thank you.
Talk into 3 parts. I'm going to talk about JCPOA a little bit, and then I'm going to talk about Iran-Europe relations a little bit, and I'm going to talk about Iran relations with its neighbors. This is my first time in Romania. It looks like a very beautiful country. In the Middle East, we have a shortage of water. It seems Romania is not facing that difficulty given the weather in the last few hours. What the Middle East has a lot is oil and gas. And given the current situation in the world, there is a renewed interest in the Middle East, given the fact that the reserves in Russia are facing difficulties with the European buyers and the Western sanctions on Russia. And when you look at the current situation in the world, the issue of Iran becomes important. And obviously, what we have had in the last number of months is the issue of JCPOA. And what's going to happen if there is an agreement, Iranian oil will be available on the market on more circumstances, more normal circumstances. If there is no agreement, Iranian oil will be in the market in a less normal circumstances. So the issue of JCPOA becomes important. As you know, the people who are running the country now in the Raisi administration were generally opposed to what was going on in the previous government. And the reason they were opposing Rouhani administration's policies was because they were cautioning the Rouhani administration that the Americans cannot be trusted. And now that they are in power, they have to be even more cautious with the agreement that they make. There is this American saying that if you fool me once, shame on you. If you fool me twice, shame on me. And people who are in Tehran are not fools. They don't want to be facing the same situation that they faced in 2018 with the US unilaterally leaving the agreement. And it is important to remember that if a country unilaterally leaves an agreement, the country needs to go back to the agreement unilaterally. You cannot wait for other things. The Biden administration had the power to do that when they came into office. On the first day of the Biden administration, he could return to the agreement the same way he returned to the Paris Climate Accords, but he refused to do that. It has been 1.5 years, more than 1.5 years since he has been in office. He's refusing to return to the agreement. And the main problem is the chaos in Washington. There are political disagreements with regard to JCPOA. We have the chairman of the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee, Robert Menendez, who is a Democrat. And in a hearing, as you may know, just 2-3 weeks ago, he openly opposed the Biden administration's JCPOA policy. He openly said that he opposes the US returning to the agreement. And this is quite rare in American politics. I teach American politics at the University of Tehran, so I tell you this from knowledge in this field, that it is very rare in American politics that the chairman of a committee opposes the president of his own party on an important issue like the nuclear agreement. So there are these difficulties in Washington. The Americans need to decide what they need to do, whether they want to return to the agreement or not. And the problem that people like Robert Malley, the US representative in the talks has, is that he is not representing the US Congress in talks. The majority of people in the US Congress, the Congress people, oppose the nuclear agreement. We're not even sure if he's representing the Biden administration, because we have had people leaving the group that is representing the US, people like Richard Nephew, Mr. Shapiro, others have left the team of US negotiators. There are even discord within the Biden administration. So when Iranian officials look at this situation, they become very cautious, whether they can trust the Americans again, given the chaos that we see in Washington. From what I know, they have been quite lenient towards the demands that the Americans have. And the fact that Iran wants to see this agreement to continue is not a demand outside the agreement. The Americans say that Iranians are asking for things that are outside the agreement. The fact that you want to make sure that the agreement continues is not something outside the agreement. And when you have powerful politicians like Robert Menendez, the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee in the US, introducing bills in the Congress that is designed to sabotage whatever agreement Iran has with the United States. When you have people like that, when you have the majority of the people in the US Congress supporting these type of bills, then the Iranian leaders become very cautious. So that's the first part of my talk. The second part is with regard to Iran's relations with Europe. As Ambassador, His Honor said a couple of hours ago, we are celebrating the 120th anniversary of Iran-Romanian relations. Historically, Iranians as people and Iranian officials have been interested in having good relations with Europe because of different reasons. Maybe they're Eurocentric, maybe they're in love with European culture, maybe they like Romanian food, I don't know. But the interest has always been to improve relations with Europe. As you know, Iran has been signing agreements with China, 25-year economic agreement with China. Iran signed another agreement with Russia right before the war when President Raisi went to Russia. I think everybody in Tehran would welcome a 25-year agreement with Romania and other European countries. We remember in the 1990s, Germany was Iran's #1 trading partner. So there is no problem in Iran with increasing and expanding relations with Europe. It is a European decision whether they want to follow some US politician in the US Congress or whether they want to follow their own people's national interest. It's a decision that they have to make. We cannot force Europeans to make that decision. It seems that European interests and American interests are not aligned all the time. I was in the Doha Forum a couple of months ago. Dr. Peder was also there. I remember a former Italian official telling me, very interesting, he was telling me that Americans are interested in fighting Russia using the last Ukrainian soldier. Whether following the US anti-Russia policy is in line with European interests, that's a decision that Europeans have to make. I don't know. I don't think so, but that's a decision that they have to make. So it seems that making sure that Europe foreign policy is not totally following the US foreign policy would be a good idea because the interests always do not match. The last part of my presentation is about Iran's relations with regional countries. As you know, the Raisi administration is highlighting the fact that Iran wants to improve relations with all its neighbors, including Saudi Arabia and UAE and countries that Iran has historically had difficult relations with. Iran is expanding its economic ties with countries like Pakistan and Afghanistan. Mr. Raisi has been to several Central Asian countries like Tajikistan and Uzbekistan and others. And Iran is basically looking for alternatives, that if the nuclear agreement doesn't work out, if Europeans decide to follow the US when it comes to their economic policy towards Iran, Iran needs to develop other alternatives. So joining the Shanghai Cooperation Agreement, joining BRICS, joining these regional economic agreements are going to be things that Iran is interested in. And at the same time, improving relations with all neighbors. Iran does not consider Saudi Arabia to be an enemy. Iran considers Saudi Arabia to be a neighbor with similar religion and similar cultural backgrounds. And Iran worries about the decision of some of these countries to get so close to Israel. Because of this changing world order, it seems some Arab countries are going to depend on Israel for their security, as they did with the United States. Since they realized that the US is a power in decline, they're looking for new partners. But I think choosing Israel as that partner is a big mistake. Israel's situation is not that good. They cannot form a government. They have a political chaos of their own. I don't know if you saw this Haaretz, this Israeli newspaper report about a month ago, that since 2020, the majority of people who live in the historical Palestinian land are Palestinians. So there are more Palestinians living in that part of the world than Israelis. And in order to keep the current government, Israel needs to become an apartheid state more than before. And if people have doubts on the apartheid situation in Israel, I encourage you to read the latest Amnesty International report, came out a couple of months ago, about Israeli apartheid and the situation, the human rights situation of Palestinians. So linking your future to a government that is practicing racism and is an apartheid state does not seem to me to be a good practice. It's like linking your future to Boris Johnson's political future. That's not going to be a good idea. Linking your future to Israel is not going to be a good idea. And overall, I think if countries like Saudi Arabia realize that fighting Iran is not going to be in line with their national interest, I think the sooner they realize that, the better that's going to be. I think I have used my time more than I should. So let me stop here, and thank you, Lily, for letting me talk more than that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Izadi. Now we have our last speaker, Dr. Qing Tian from China, who's joining us virtually.
Hi. Can you hear me, President? Yes. Yes. So first, I want to say thank you to our Romanian hosts. So we have been attending this important conference forum for the last 2 or 3 years, and I'm also want to say hello to our Russian and Iranian friends. So my presentation is about the destiny of Iran nuclear negotiations. 1 year ago, I was not so sure about the direction of this nuclear talk. 4 months ago, I was optimistic about it. Right now, I'm pessimistic about it, and I'd like to make 3 points here. First, I think Iran nuclear talk has entered a phase which can be labeled as no success, no failure. No success is because there isn't much economic benefits for both sides, especially Iran. Iran has been exporting 1 million barrels per day since the end of the last year. Relying on this oil revenue, Iran can maintain its basic economic lifeline. What a revived JCPOA can bring to Iran is a big question mark. So there isn't too much urgency from Iranian side. No failure is because both Iran and United States don't want to repeat the high tensions we saw in 2019. US is highly tolerant about Iran's behavior in the Persian Gulf and the whole region. Iran is also carefully playing its regional card. If we consider the election results of Iraqi election 2021 and the Lebanon elections this year as a negative for Iran's allies, then raising tensions with the United States in the region is not very good for Iran's regional influence. Secondly, we should adjust our assessment of JCPOA. I mean, we can't overstate JCPOA's importance. Even if JCPOA is successfully revived, it will be still very weak or unsustainable under the background of United States' internal polarized politics. A Republican president will try to limit JCPOA's effectiveness or even destroy the deal. The Biden administration took JCPOA once as a key to solve regional issues. But it seems that the regional geopolitical situation can improve or can go on without the success of JCPOA. From last year to now, we have seen lots of rapprochement between regional countries. For example, between Turkey and Israel, between Turkey and Saudi, between Arab countries and Israel, etc. If we push further, the question will be, without JCPOA, can we deal with the Middle East? Next week, President Biden will visit Middle East. He seems will score his points on Arab-Israel relation, on resetting Saudi and US relations. But his focus seems not on Iran nuclear issue. Thirdly, maybe JCPOA is not as important as several years ago, but it's still a good deal. P4+1 thinks so. So does United States. So my thinking is that how can actors other than Iran help to revive JCPOA? I think this is what big powers like United States, Russia, and China should think about. When JCPOA finalized last time in 2015, a multilateral effort by P5+1 played a very positive and critical role. In the following years, both United States-Russia relations and the US-China relation deteriorated. On Iran nuclear issue, the coordination between US-China, the coordination between Russia-US is not as smooth as in 2015. Citing sanctions as an example, the United States is now sanctioning heavily on Russia and to a less extent, China. Russia is coordinating anti-sanction efforts with Iran. China is vocally against the unilateral sanctions and long-arm jurisdiction. And China is also continue our legitimate trade exchange with both Russia and Iran. So maybe it's time for United States to rethink the solution of reviving JCPOA, not only focus on US-Iran negotiations, but also changing the approach to China and Russia. So much for my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Qing Tian. Now we do have 10 minutes. Do you have any questions? Come over. All right, okay. I don't see any hands. I'll go ahead and wrap up here. I'll just say a few words then. I want to echo Minister Teodoro's suggestion as well as Professor Izzati's suggestion that Middle East could try to find some common ground and work from a regional organization. As somebody from a small state in Southeast Asia, I will share this. Had it not been for ASEAN, the regional organization, Singapore would have been on the menu and not at the table. So I see the beauty and the critical use of regional organization. And last but not least, just one more word. I think as humans, there are people we just don't like. But just because we refuse to make certain people or certain countries our friends, we don't have to make them our enemies. And if we can just stay on that line, I think, we're heading in a good direction. So thank you so much, panelists. Let's give them a round of applause.